As you might expect, the Intent API requires you to authenticate to it before it lets you issue any of the more powerful commands. So as we write our script, we have to accommodate the API authentication process. Here's what we're going to do in this demo. Again, you should already have Python 3 or later installed. Our script is going to do three main things. It'll install the appropriate Python library that will allow us to send HTTPS requests to the API and process the resulting responses. We'll then craft our script to authenticate to the Cisco DNA Center sandbox that we used earlier. This is going to be the same sandbox, but instead of authenticating to the DNA Center web interface, we are going to authenticate directly to the API. Finally, once we're authenticated, we should be able to get a list of network devices. We'll need to install the Python request library that will allow us to make HTTPS requests to the Intent API. And the easiest way to install it is to use the requirements.txt file I've included in the exercise files for this module. Now, if you do a cat requirements.txt, or if you're using a Windows-based system, you could do type requirements.txt. You can see the name of the library, and all you have to do is run pip install-r requirements.txt. You may get a message that the requirement is already satisfied, and that's fine. All that matters is that we have this library installed. Okay, next, go ahead and load up the file named intent-api.py. And then, once you do that, please go ahead and launch your Python interpreter, Python 3. All right, now the first thing we need to do is import the JSON and request libraries, and we'll do that by executing these three commands right here. Scroll down a little bit. And next we need to obtain an authentication token from the Intent API. The way we do that is by passing valid credentials in the HTTP basic auth header. So we'll go ahead and highlight these two here, execute these. Now if the authentication succeeds, the API should return a response containing a token. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. We've stored the response in this response variable. So I'm going to go ahead and execute that. Now this is not the entire response. It's basically just the HTTP response code, which is 200, which means OK. This indicates that authentication was successful, and so we should have a token buried somewhere here in the response body. So let's take a look at the response body in JSON format. And here we go. This looks a lot like a token, very random looking. Now for future API requests, we will need to pass in this token every single time. So let's extract this token from the response and store it in a variable appropriately named token. Scrolling down a little bit here, we're going to go and just save the token body as the variable token. There we go. Now to make things easier, we'll go ahead and create the HTTP headers containing the authentication token. The header that the Intent API is looking for is called x-auth-token. So here we're going to go ahead and store those headers in the headers variable. Okay, we're almost there. To get a list of network devices, we will use this URL that calls the network device command, which just gives a list of all the network devices in DNA Center. Finally, scrolling down a little bit, we'll send our request to the URL along with those HTTP headers. Now the response gets stored in the response variable, and it is very long and not very pretty to look at. So we'll use the json.dumps Python function to make it presentable. Scrolling down right here, execute that. So let's go ahead and expand the terminal here. Now I'm not going to go through all of this, but if I scroll up just a bit until we get to the host name, it's pretty obvious that this is describing a Catalyst 9300 switch. We have a management IP address, uptime, and scrolling up a little bit, we can see the operating system is iOS XE. We've also got the serial number and MAC address here. So this is really powerful. You can easily create a current list of every device in your network in just a few minutes. And we're not limited to just big lists of devices. We can get info on a single device. Let's take the device with the management IP of 10.10.20.51. This here is actually a wireless LAN controller. We can grab the info for just this device by calling this URL right here. Let's go ahead and get my prompt back here, and we'll give it a shot. Let's go ahead and highlight all three of these lines. I'm going to execute all three of these in sequence. And there we go. Let's expand the terminal again. And if I scroll up a little bit, notice we have the management IP and platform ID. And if I scroll up even more, you can see this is all we get. This is the beginning of the output. Now, so far we've seen everything working right. Generally, if you see an HTTP response code beginning with a 2, that is a good sign. But what happens if we get some other response code? One way that might happen is if we use invalid credentials, in which case we would get a 401 not authenticated error. To illustrate this, let's try to obtain an authentication token using invalid credentials. Let's get my prompt back here. I'm going to go ahead and use the invalid credentials devnet user for the username and wrong password for the password. Let's see what happens. We get a 401 response code, and you already know why, but if you didn't, you could just look at the response text to figure it out. Let's go and run this right here. Authentication has failed for user devnet user. And authentication has failed, of course, because we gave the wrong credentials. Another way we can get a 401 response is if we try to use the API without passing in any authentication token at all. Scrolling down a little bit, let's try this. We're going to go ahead and request just the URL without passing any kind of authentication headers in. Now recall that the URL is the same one we used to gather the info for the wireless LAN controller, but because we're not passing in a valid authentication token via the HTTP headers, we get a 401 unauthorized response. If we look at the body there, we can see it just says unauthorized. Now, if you call an API command that does not exist, you will get a 404 not found error. Let's go and try this. We're going to go ahead and do this wrong URL here, and this is actually referencing an API call that does not exist. There we get a 404. Now notice this time we do pass in the authentication token, but the network device API call does not actually exist. So we get a 404 error. By the way, I encourage you with great enthusiasm to play around with the intent API on your own. Check out the documentation at this URL here and try out different API commands for DNA Center and ST-Access. You know what I always say, practice, practice, practice. You cannot learn about this just by watching a video. You have to get hands-on with it. Even though you don't necessarily have to get hands-on for the exam, you really need to understand how these APIs work, and the best way to do that is by experiencing them for yourself.